This week we will talk about culture, and we've spent a lot of time building up to this point. We've mentioned culture, we've addressed it with respect to cultural anthropology as a subfield of American anthropology. We've talked about the appearance of modern culture with the appearance of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and so now we're going to more explicitly define what culture is and talk about why it's so interesting and why it's something that potentially could be considered unique among humans. So we'll talk about how we define culture and critically what are the five key defining features of culture. We will talk about the evolutionary basis for culture. What do we share with other species, particularly great apes, chimpanzees, etc., and what aspects of human culture thusly are different. We will talk about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, two different paradigms for viewing the world, each of which have pros and cons. And we will tie that in then to the this discussion of universal human rights. And we will talk about the mechanisms of cultural change. And so there's no doubt that we share society with other species. We can define society as organized life in groups. We also can firmly state that great apes have rudimentary cultural abilities. We're going to talk next week specifically about language and some of the building blocks of human language that are present in great ape species. And we will talk today about some of these, or this week about some of these cultural trends that we see with non-human primates. But only humans have fully elaborated cultures. These are distinctive traditions and customs that are transmitted over the generations through learning and through language. Tyler, a 19th century British anthropologist, defined cultures as systems of human behavior and thought that could be studied scientifically because they obey natural laws. And he pointed out the fact that there's a process by which kids kind of internalize the dominant features of the culture in which they grow up, and we call that then enculturation. Before we jump into these five key defining features of culture, I want to mention something that I haven't formalized into lecture slides, but it's one of these things, one of these differences, one of these defining features of what makes humans so fantastic, and it stems from, it's been discussed in philosophy, but it also stems from some work done by an evolutionary anthropologist, Augustine Fuentes, who is based out of the University of Notre Dame. And Augustine is a primatologist at heart, has done a lot of work with actually both old and new world primates. But he also is pretty excellent at communicating with just the general public and does a lot of science writing for the general public. And he came out with a book fairly recently called The Human Spark. And he gave a talk at UNM a couple of semesters ago in advance of this book being released. And he was supposed to talk about what's so similar between humans and non-human species, and then what's so different. And conventionally, there's been a lot of discussion about what we share with other primates. What other features do we have or what features do we have by just the nature of being primates that don't make us special per se? But he said, that's all well and good, but what's really interesting are the ways that we're different. And we've already discussed this a little bit. We talked about how we only, for example, have a 1.4% genetic difference with chimpanzees. However, we've ended up with these phenomenally larger brains. We're bipedal. We've got these complexities like spoken language, control of fire, things that are hallmarks of human culture. And the way that Augustine presents it is in this nature of what he calls semiosis. This this he talks about the ubiquitous niche that humans fulfill, and if we actually get to cover our making meaning section, we will talk about semiosis and the semiotic environment a bit more there. But the idea that, if we were to look at moles, for example, their ubiquitous habitat, their ubiquitous environment would be fossorial. That means they're digging underground. If we were to look at birds, with the exception, of course, of flightless birds like ostriches and rays and emus, and with the exception of birds like penguins, their ubiquitous niche is in the air, right? If we were to look at monkeys, it would be in trees. If we were to look at whales, it would be aquatic, right? So when trying to define then this ubiquitous feature of humans, it's not one particular ecology per se. Rather, it is something called semiosis, a semiotic environment, which means that humans create meaning. Humans live in a niche that is defined by creating meaning. And when we think about how we measure meaning and even how we create meaning, we're talking about human culture. So this human spark, so to speak, is this cultural ability. We referred to it in our hominin evolution lecture as as behavioral modernity, that point that we become fully human, fully modern human, both physically and behaviorally. And so, just think about that. Think about how we are predisposed, perhaps, because of genetics and because of our evolved nature, to create environments of meaning, and we do that instrumentally through creating culture. So now that we've had that discussion of semiosis, we will talk about these specific defining features of culture. Firstly, culture is learned. What do we mean by this? Well, when we look at all humans, all modern humans that live today, we've got um, similar capacities for culture. Any human, all humans are wired to express culture. That is something that lies in our genetics, lies in our evolutionary heritage. The learned aspect, however, has to do with the particular cultural features that we express. And so, for example, all humans have the capacity for language. But the environment comes in with respect to these specific languages that people speak. How did you learn to speak English or Spanish, for example? It was by being exposed to English and Spanish speakers. So the capacity for language is biologically based, but the language we express is culturally based. Our cultural learning depends on our capacity to use symbols. Symbols are defined as signs that have no necessary or causal connections, natural connections, to the things that they stand for and signify. And so when you think about language again, the words that we say for things have no natural or causal connections to what they signify. The alphabets we use have no natural or causal connections to the things that they signify. The logos, like Starbucks having a double-tailed mermaid, right? No natural or causal connection. There's not something about double-tailed mermaids that screams consistent cup of coffee kind of across, Starbucks the world over, right? So many of the things that we express culturally are what we would call arbitrary. Think about fashion trends, think about movie choices, think about song lyrics, and the songs that break the top 10, right? All of those things are purely arbitrary. One definition of culture defines it as ideas that are based on learning and symbols, with cultures as the control mechanisms or the programs that govern behavior. And so we can think about kind of what's innate, these natural biological urges, and how we culturally express them. So let's take one. Let's take food. Right? Why do we eat? Well, we eat because we get hungry. Why do we get hungry? Because given our metabolism and the fact that we are living creatures who need to grow and reproduce, we have to give ourselves an energy budget with which to work. And so it is that need for energy that drives our hunger. All right, when you're hungry, let's pretend it's an emotional eating kind of setting, right? Your significant other has broken up with you. You're feeling very low, very upset. You're at home. What are you going to reach for? right? That's going to be culturally and even perhaps individually or family level specific. It might be ice cream. It might be chocolate. You might live in a culture that doesn't have access to many sweets, and it might be something like miso soup. It might be macaroni and cheese. It might be pizza, right? It's that emotional eating, of course, is triggered by this intense emotion. That emotional eating is, kind of this biological response to sadness, but what we reach for is culturally dependent. Our hunger is stimulated by uh, these biological triggers and our need to consume food, but what we eat is going to be based on what's available. Hunter gatherers, when they get hungry, they're going to long for meat, and specifically wild animal meat, hunted game. When we get hungry, might long for pizza, might long for a hamburger, so on and so forth. If you're in Japan and you find yourself getting hungry, you might go for udon or sushi or something similar. So our food cravings might crave particular macronutrients like protein or fat. However, the actual foods that we eat are going to be culturally dependent. Through enculturation, or this process by which human children learn culture, people generally or gradually internalize a previously established system of meanings and symbols. This then helps to guide their behavior throughout and perceptions throughout their lives. So think about being raised in a religious household, right? If you were raised in a religious household, chances are you subscribe to the same major world religion that your parents did, which is often consistent over generations. So maybe your grandparents did as well. Chances are, if you belong to a particular religious household, you have cultural traditions surrounding prayer time. If you happen to be Muslim, you have to pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. If you happen to be Christian, it may be limited to prayers at meals or prayers before bed. If you're Catholic, you might recite prayers that are common across anybody who practices Catholicism, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, etc. So much of your religious expression then is conditioned based on what you were exposed to during your childhood, based on what you grew up knowing. It becomes familiar, it becomes second nature. There's nothing innate about crossing yourself when you're frightened or when you're trying to petition an almighty deity, right? That is something that's conditioned, but it becomes second nature. One of the things that kind of lends strength to this statement is the fact that it's pretty easy to get kids to internalize or start practicing a new cultural trend, a new cultural trait. It's not so easy to get people in their 80s to practice a new cultural trait. I mean, think about adoption of technology. Before my grandmother died, she did get a computer and she had access to email. And all the emails that I got were either chain letters that said that Bill Gates would give you $5 for every time or every person you copied that letter to, or cutesy kinds of precious moment sorts of illustrations that told me how much she loved me, right? She's not using email strategically in the same way that you are using email. So, it's easier to adopt to new behaviors, new cultural trends, the younger you are before you've given kind of your lifetime over to internalizing a particular set or kind of code of behavior. And culture is learned through direct instruction, through observation, through experiences, through interaction with others, through both conscious and unconscious behavior modification. So we're constantly being exposed to cultural features, to different behaviors, different values, etc. And we learn what to express based on kind of conditioning, right? Operant conditioning almost, based on the reactions that we get from others. So things like language, we are being directly taught. I mean, particularly vocabulary building through public schooling, right? How many times do you use things like wayward and vagabond in your speech? Probably not very often. However, those might fall on high school level vocabulary lists when you're reading period literature. We observe people. Think about how babies pick up behaviors and interactions, right? How do babies learn to wave? Well, they learn to wave through observing people. I've got a friend who has a 6-month-old, and he just went for his well child checkup, and one of the questions on kind of the list of 6-month development is your baby waving yet? And her answer was no. And she's like, why is my baby not waving? And then she observed her family over the next few days and realized they don't wave. They hug, they say things, they give the Vulcan sign of live long and prosper, but there's no waving being done by her other children or her husband. And so the baby hasn't had the opportunity to observe very much waving. So, babies are a great example of this observational picking up of cultural features. Yeah. So, what is our second defining feature of culture? It is symbolic. A symbol is defined as something that can be verbal or nonverbal within a particular language or culture that comes to stand for something else. And so, an anthropologist by the name of White stated that culture originated when our ancestors acquired the ability to use symbols to originate and bestow meaning on a thing or event. So we talked, for example, about cave paintings in hominin evolution, right? And the fact that archaeologists tend to subscribe some sort of ritual or significant meaning to what's being painted on cave walls. And that's one danger with studying past societies is that we are quick to ascribe meaning or significance to features when actually they might not have any particular meaning associated with them. There's some really funny if you understand it, I guess, archaeology humor, some memes that circulate around that talk about this very thing that, like a joke that we could all bury ourselves wearing sunglasses, and it could be the symbol to future archaeologists of some sun-worshipping cult or something along those lines. So when we were talking about tool tradition across hominins, we talked about a significant leap in cognition that came with the jump from Oldowan to Acheulean tools, right? We talked about it a little bit with respect to the difference between Lomekwian and Oldowan tools, right? That we're making a leap through the development of tool traditions from looking at the rock itself as the useful object or the tool to looking at the rock as the source of the useful objects or tools. That the rock itself, aside from being hard and fracturing in predictable ways, isn't so useful, but our abstract concept of what we could turn it into is. And that's where we really see a leap in tool complexity. And that is similarly related to this idea of symbolism, of being able to understand and use symbols. Symbols are often linguistic. Our words are symbols. Our letters are symbols. Our entire language is symbolic. But we can often also have nonverbal symbols. So think about logos, right? My daughter, when she was 9 months old, we would pass by the double-tailed mermaid, and in her car seat, she would start pointing, going, eh, eh, eh. She couldn't say Starbucks, but she had already learned, probably through my intense caffeine addiction, that the double-tailed mermaid meant something good. Usually she would get to have a sip or two of whatever I was having, or I'd get her a kid's cocoa. Not at 9 months, but later I'd get her a kid's cocoa or something along those lines. So she was able to recognize symbols at a very long age, a low age, a very young age. Think about symbols of nationality, right? What are we supposed to do when the flag is raised and the Star-Spangled Banner starts to play? We're supposed to stand up, remove our hats, perhaps put our hand over our hearts, though that's not necessarily required, and be respectful and reverential while looking at the flag. Think about religious icons, right? We can look at something that is two straight lines that are crossed not at the midpoint, and we could call it a T in our linguistic symbol, or we could call it a cross, and that would evoke a whole system or a whole kind of cascade of religious connotation. And much of what's used in the liturgy, regardless of what religion you follow, is symbolic in nature. Is holy water, for example, really sanctified by a deity. I mean, it's generally tap water that's blessed by a priest. If you've ever taken a pilgrimage to Chimayo, and gotten yourself some of the holy dirt, right? What happens when they run out of dirt? They bring in and fill in the hole. They replenish the dirt after it's been blessed by a priest. So these are all symbolic representations of something. Language is arguably the distinctive possession of Homo sapiens. Well, we'll talk about that next week. I'll put a caveat here that this is potentially debatable, and next week we will discuss the language capabilities of great apes, as well as talk a little bit about perhaps when language originated. And we also have to throw in, with language discussions, we've got to throw in cetaceans, dolphins, and toothed whales. No other animal, we can say this with certainty, has the elaborated cultural abilities to the extent that Homo has. That just means that really, when we're talking about methods of adaptation or kind of responding to environmental stressors, we don't rely on biology first. Biology just kind of hitches along for a ride. We rely on culture well before we look to biological means of adaptation. We are the epitome of cultural creatures. I mean, put us in a Roman gladiator arena, right, against lions or tigers and bears. Oh my, if we didn't have access to tools, to technology, armor, etc., we would have all been slaughtered, right? We're not strong. We're not fast. We don't have sharp teeth. We don't have a thick hide that is impervious to puncture, right? We're pretty weak and scrawny when it comes down to it. But what we have is our brain that allows us to then innovate cultural solutions to these kinds of problems. Our third feature is that culture is shared. It is not an attribute of individuals. It is shared by individuals as members of groups. And then enculturation unifies people by providing common experiences, shared beliefs, values, memories, and expectations, right? That's much of what public school is. Some conservatives will say that public school is an indoctrination system. I guess in a way it is, because you're expecting that people will have the same kinds of values, be capable of learning the same kind of information at the same ages. We do still require, not at the federal level, but many school systems require standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. What if you're not a citizen? You're still expected to stand and be reverential, so on and so forth. But really, it's these shared experiences that unite people in a universal kind of or common cultural framework. And so, one funny kind of anecdotal evidence for this is that if you ever travel outside of the country and you meet somebody else from America, right? Particularly if you're somewhere where Americans don't travel often. When I was in Indonesia, for example, I was one of the only white English speakers that many of the people I was living with had ever seen. And a guy came over from Canada, and we were just like thrilled that we could share a language, right? So we smoked a cigar and had a beer and had a great conversation about more Western, more English-speaking kinds of foods and things like that, like a hamburger or something along those lines. So we found an affinity because of a shared cultural feature. If you travel out of the country, you travel out of the state, you meet somebody else from New Mexico, right? You're going to be like, hey, we've got something in common. And you're going to talk about green chili. You travel out of after you're done with your higher education, right? I go somewhere and I see somebody with a Virginia Tech sweatshirt on. I'm like, hey, you're a Hokie. And it's like, well, how do you have the affiliation? Sometimes you even get a question like, oh, you were a biology major? I knew a biology major. Did you know so-and-so? And that's when you're reminded that, oh, we went to a school with 50,000 students, the chances of us knowing each other, even though we had the same major and may have been there in the same years, is really, really small. So, we look for these shared connections. And so, one good example of how culture is not really very useful if it's not shared is, let's say you create a secret language. You've got a club, right? And you create your own language so that you can write messages to each other without everybody else figuring out what you're saying. If you're a club of one, those messages aren't going to be received, right? If you are the only one who understands the language that you created, that language is completely useless for communication. You've got to at least have two people. The more people you have that understand the language, the more useful it becomes in conversation and communicating information. The fourth feature is that culture is all encompassing. When we define culture anthropologically, it encompasses features that may be regarded as trivial or unworthy of serious study, such as pop culture. There was a tendency to, in a manner, to justify European imperialism and colonialism, to view or rate cultures on their level of being quote unquote civilized, right? And so there were things that were considered more civilized than other things. So, if we think about quote unquote civilized things, we might think about the opera, not the latest, I don't know, I'm trying to think of pop culture right now, not the latest, Justin Bieber song or something like that. Um, we might think of the ballet instead of Tyler Perry's Medea, right? We are going to think, when we think of quote unquote culture, big C culture, we're going to think of things that maybe we've ascribed some level of sophistication or significance to. That's totally wrong. There are pop culture is every bit as worthy of serious study as civilized culture, as period literature, as opera, as whatever the case may be. So you could completely study reality TV shows and compare kind of the anthropology of reality TV shows. You could study the anthropology of memes as a system of humor and communicating a message, right? So every aspect of culture is equally valuable, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about cultures that don't really have any material goods, like foragers whose only music can be created through their vocal cords or perhaps a flute, versus a full opera symphony chorus with full complement of musical instruments. So all culture is equally valuable. To understand contemporary North American culture, we have to consider things like social media, cell phones, the internet, television, fast food restaurants, sports, and games. When you thought about that question of what are you going to eat when you're hungry, did any of you jump to fast food, right? Blake's, right? Am I right that Blake's is a New Mexico phenomenon? So, we can think about we really have to understand all aspects of culture. We can't understand Americans based solely on studying people who attend baseball games, for example, even though baseball is considered quote unquote America's pastime, or American football, right? To understand all of America, we've got to look at the entirety of cultural expression. Lastly, culture is integrated. It is integrated by dominant economic activities and related social patterns, sets of values, ideas, symbols, and judgments. So, what do we mean by this? Well, we can think of society's quote unquote core values, these key basic central values. If you ever watch any of the or kind of watch videos of old advertisements, right? Let's talk about the ads that were on in the 1950s when televisions were starting to become commonplace across American homes. If those ads depicted women, what kinds of roles did those women fill? Well, 9 times out of 10, they would have been the housewife, the homemaker. It would have been a mother who stays at home and cleans and cooks, right? I mean, things like vacuum cleaners were supposed to be mommy's little helper. They were supposed to save women time when it came to cleaning floors, washing machines, another thing. And that was really supposed to save women time. We didn't often see women depicted in careers. If they were, it was perhaps as a secretary, of a stewardess, or some other very kind of stereotypical female role. Now, if we were to look at the career options that are available to women, we find that women can really do almost anything. They can't be sperm donors generally, unless we're talking about women as a transgender issue and how you feel inside. I mean, when we're talking about biological women who have ovaries, who have a uterus, and who produce eggs, you're not going to get women who donate sperm as a career path, right? But, women can be doctors, lawyers, fighter pilots, astronauts, right? We raise our girls telling them they can be anything that they want to be, and we've got to have media and pop culture and things like that, depictions of women doing those sorts of things. So, you get like Barbie the veterinarian, you get Barbie the physician, you get Barbie works at NASA, or, the newest Lego sets with the women in science. So, everything that we do is integrated. When we think about core values of the US, for example, what do you think of? Maybe it's freedom. Maybe it's democracy. Um, how are those things? Maybe it's individualism. How are those things represented or integrated into other features of our culture? Well, we could think about something like individualism, and think about how work is assigned in schools, how GPAs are assigned, how children are recognized for their academic pursuits, right? You if it's generally perceived that if you as an individual work hard in school, that's all it's going to take to get you to be successful as an adult. We're not really as interested in things like social harmony, conservation, uh, issues like that. So we might say things like it's a dog eat dog world, that if you're not going to strive for something, somebody else is, right? We have sayings, we have euphemisms, we have messages that we give men and women constantly that identify some of those key core values. One of the things that's talked about in modern kind of psychology and sociology is the idea of toxic masculinity, right? And it's talked about in a context of maybe it's what's driving sexual assault, maybe it's what's driving violence against women, this culture of toxic masculinity. And then you take a step back and you look at the messages that our boys are getting, right? What are boy colors for newborn infant boys? Blue, brown, gray, green, maybe, but a dark forest green, not like a fresh spring green. You don't put boys in pink, right? Boys don't want fairies and butterflies and hearts and cute fluffy kittens on their clothes. They want monster trucks and dinosaurs and various sports paraphernalia, right? Really, when you're talking about a newborn, they don't care what clothing they're wearing. I mean, maybe they don't even like to wear clothing. My kids, the ones at least that were born in the summer, hated wearing clothing. They went around in a diaper most of the time that we were at home. So, we are already gendering our boys towards quote unquote tough boy things, from a very young age. Then when they get older, we say comments like boys don't cry, man up, grow a pair, so on and so forth. So, it's no surprise that by the time boys reach adulthood, that they have this idea of what men are supposed to be, and that it's tough, it's machismo, it's this kind of toxic expression of masculinity, and then that results in violence against women. All right, so what are some of the core values in the US? We talked about that. What are some of the core values in New Mexico? One of the things that students often say is family, and that is very, very true. I mean, for me, having grown up on the East Coast versus seeing families in New Mexico, particularly Hispanic families, have a much kind of larger value placed on familial connectedness, on staying close to their kid. I mean, heck, my parents live almost 2,000 miles away, right? They could die. They're entering into their 70s. They could die and I wouldn't even know it. And that's kind of scary to me, right? So we do have values in New Mexico that differ slightly, sometimes significantly, from values in other states. I mean, think about the immigration issue in New Mexico versus Arizona. Right? Arizona has a much larger proportion of rich white people that live there, and thusly they've got more kind of restrictive, prejudicial, um, discriminatory attitudes towards immigrants than New Mexicans do. And so here we just have a picture talking about these integrated systems. When one behavior changes, we also get other behaviors that change. And it looks at this example of the 1950s. Here you've got the housewife who's having her kids clean up and put dishes away, or perhaps even set the table for dinner. Now we see images of women in the workforce. Here we've got a doctor and two nurses, all three of whom are women. So as we change the career options that are available to women, we have to change the imagery that's present in social media. We've got to change kind of the message of what we're telling our girls that they can potentially become.